ARH 110. And I've been running my own design studio out of my house for the past 18 months. And I've been designing all on my own as a sole proprietor. And I've picked up a few kind of techniques that I've used to transition into going from working in an office with others around me to working by myself all day that I thought I'd share today. And I'd like to keep this fairly informal. I'll go through this and then we can go back and feel free to ask any questions that you might have, or comments or feedback or thoughts or anything to start a discussion. Happy to stay and do that as well. So that being said, let's get into it. So I'm talking about designing alone today. I wanted to share some examples and techniques and strategies that I've used over the past 18 months. The name of my firm is Prestereo. You can check it out at prestereo.com if you'd like to see more of what I do. I started about 18 months ago. I work out of my house. This is my desk, really messy, but I wanted to give you an actual idea of what it looks like to be working from home. So this recent transition hasn't been too much of a change for me. Luckily, I was already kind of set up to work remote. I have two coworkers. They are cats. Their names are Fraser and Lilith. They are very friendly and cuddly, fun to have around, but they're not great in terms of helping with design and getting design feedback. So I often find myself in situations where designer's block can set in. You're sitting there working alone, you're trying to push through a deadline, and you got to develop ways to kind of get around it. So a few things that I've developed over the past year and a half, there's sort of 4 things that I've realized when I look back that I started kind of doing and really trying to be intentional about now. And those are, first is stick with the strong design concept. Try to decide early on what you're doing and stick to your guns, stick with it and see where it takes you. Second is sketch really small and iterate in your sketching. Third one is change up what you're doing, change up tasks, always keep moving forward. And the last one, this one's really important, is be super flexible. And I've got some examples of these different techniques to share with you now. First one, stick with the concept. You know, when I'm designing, and especially in architecture school, it was always the case that I'd have one idea, then another idea, and another idea. And the ideas would keep coming, and you find yourself not really staying focused. Let me try this out. Let me try this different idea. The idea with a concept instead is that it keeps you focused. Start out early on, figure out what you're trying to do. Then I try to constantly basically iterate, and instead of coming up with different idea after different idea, take an idea, iterate and make it better, and make it better. And for me, design concepts can take up many different types of forms. I'll show this first example as sort of more of an abstract concept. This was a project I completed a few years ago, actually, before I went out on my own, which was 2 townhome units. It's a duplex. They're mirrored units next to each other. The first 2 diagrams here show the 2 units on the site and then the town planning required setbacks. Not very exciting, but that's the maximum buildable area. So how do we actually start to create interesting architecture out of this? So I developed a concept, which is an abstract concept, about thinking of the main dividing wall between these units as being sort of a vertebrae. And I came up with this visual sort of a leaf vertebrae and leaf veins growing out from it. And the second 2 images show how the program areas like the bedrooms, the kitchen, the bathrooms, all that stuff can actually grow off of the central wall. And the last one kind of shows some orthogonal treatments for how this abstract concept would actually grow. And so the next step is really to take that concept further and explore in the digital realm. And utilizing this concept, I'm not here creating architecture, I'm here creating form. Taking the idea of kind of the central party wall and having spaces that's sort of adjacent to it, but float off of it and grow off of it. That became kind of more iterations on the bottom. There's many more not shown here. But then taking that abstract concept and applying it to architecture, and eventually came up with this rendering on the right, which is essentially taking the initial ideas, that central party wall, spaces growing off of it, and creating actual architecture from it. But if I hadn't had this idea, this concept, abstract notion of spaces growing off from the central dividing partition, I never would have been able to get there. So to me, this was really a really good learning experience of how a concept can actually drive you to unique architecture. Here's some images of the completed project. This one here is the front, and then another shot of the front. Another example of a concept doesn't necessarily have to be as abstract as that. This project, I utilize a very practical concept. This is a interior design project for a client in San Francisco in the Mission District. And they had a very large kind of open plan living space. When you'd enter the space, there's a living room, dining space, kitchen, and no sort of dividing walls or anything between them, completely open, all white, kind of really a really blank canvas. And they wanted to think of ways to kind of divide the space up and make it feel like separate spaces. So I came up with this plan and I showed it to them, and I actually delineated different areas of focus that we could try to solve for in the design. And they are things like some sort of ceiling element that delineates the dining area from the adjacent spaces, some sort of wall space that also helps divide the space, a different finish in the living room versus new finishes in the kitchen that help to create unique spaces throughout that design. And so basically kind of laid out a framework of what we're trying to do, so a practical concept, and then figure out how we're going to do it. So taking this list of interventions, and then I started sketching. So basically, what does that ceiling element look like? There's something that kind of starts on the wall and crawls up on the ceiling. What happens in the rest of the spaces? And then from there, iterate, and then the finished project here shows that we've got some sort of paint, well, not some sort of, it is paint, on the ceiling, which actually divides up the spaces. We've got this screen here, which divides the central hallway from the living area. And then the small interventions, the bookcase, that screen, and then the finishes in the kitchen. But again, if I hadn't started with a concept of a list of things we're actually trying to do, it'd be really hard to actually identify what you're doing when you design. So again, it really helps me focus. Another example here, this is a mix of sort of a practical and an abstract design concept for this project. I was approached by an older couple who live up north in the middle of nowhere in Mendocino County. They've got like 130 acres. They wanted to build a concrete house with an organic roof. And they already had this pretty cool floor plan they'd already developed. And then they had this clay model they'd put together. And it was interesting, but it didn't really have any kind of reason for existing in this way. The forms were kind of curved. They really hadn't thought out, what it is these forms were actually trying to do. They just noted they wanted something curvy. They wanted a floor plan like this. So I sat down and tried to rationalize and create kind of a more formal concept for this project to figure out how this could create a concept for them. So this is a series of diagrams that show that. The first is, let's take the floor plan and let's actually rationalize it into a structural grid that actually makes some sense and can be built. And then the second one is, instead of having kind of separate roofs that are kind of curved in all the spaces, let's create a continuous roof that actually provides shading in certain areas. So on the eastern side, we've got the sun coming into the master bedroom. And then along the southern side, we're shading into the living spaces. And then let's start to articulate that roof form even more. What if we can start to pull it up and allow for different views? So in this case, there's an awesome view into a valley to the north. This is a view from the master bedroom, and then the western side has got a view as well. So taking their initial kind of ideas, rationalizing them, having a very kind of formal concept develop out of making the roof form do things that are practical, shading, views. Then that developed into kind of the final concept design for them, which is shown here. So you can see how that roof form is now one continuous curved concrete form. It's rationalized along a structure, and then it opens up in spaces where you want views, and then kind of closes down in spaces where you want more privacy. There's the backyard again, showing how it shades along the back. And then the master bedroom space showing a little bit of shading and then some privacy happening, but then opening in certain areas where we have view. And here's the same area, the same space from the interior. But again, without having this strong concept, laying out exactly what I was trying to do, it would be really hard to come up with some sort of organic form that had no reason for being. So it was a way to keep me focused. The second thing is sketch really small. Not everyone does this. I am a horrible sketcher, horrible at sketching. This is a not so great sketch of a bathroom project. You can see it's pretty messy. It's pretty big as shown here, but it doesn't really need to be this big. This is the same sketch at a much smaller scale, and this is actually more similar to the size I actually drew it at. And this is something I never really got when I was in architecture school. I'd always sketch really, really big, fill up the whole page, and my sketches would look not great. And you want a sketch to look good because it gives you confidence in the project. So a sketch that doesn't look great will make you think maybe the design isn't great. But if you can sketch it at a more appropriate scale, in this case, much smaller, you're getting into much less detail. You're sort of just saying there's some sort of gridded tile. There's some sort of very clean vanity that's rectilinear with the mirror on top, some sort of towel rack, some sort of mix of colors, but you're not getting into too much detail. That, sketching at that smaller scale, will then give me confidence that I can do it quickly, iterate, and give me confidence that's actually going to turn into something which will be interesting in the end. And this is actually that, the finished project, which actually looks fairly similar to the sketch. Another example, sketching really small. This is a sketch of a floor plan. I like to sketch over a grid, because a grid makes my messy lines appear more straight, and it kind of guides me a little bit. And I tend to design very orthogonal forms, at least initially. So this is a really small sketch. It's only about 3 inches wide, but this sketch actually became the most important sketch for this project, because this sketch actually turned into the final floor plan. So you can see we've got sort of a living space here that's got this sort of wall that turns a corner to create a little bit of privacy from the yard, which is shown here. Then we step up, we've got a dining space, and then we've got a side yard here, and we've got that central wall dividing the space. This is actually that first project I'd shown you. So having that sketch, working it out, it actually solved a lot of problems for me. Again, that sketch is tiny. It's only about, it's like 3 inches wide. And I still have that sketch. It's like 5 years old, and it turned out to be one of the most important sketches for this project. Again, really small, and for me, really messy. Next example, I'm a big fan of Post-its. This is actually looking out of my living room window currently. We're up on a hill, which is cool, great view. But Post-its are great because you can actually sketch. It forces you to sketch at a really small scale, and it really is really good for iterating. So I might sketch like 1 or 2 concepts, or 1 or 2 ways of implementing a concept on one Post-it, put it up, do another, until I have this sea of Post-its. And then you can kind of pick at them and say, all right, this one's working, this one's not. But I love how they force you to stay at a really, really small scale. Forces you to only solve enough of the design problem that's appropriate for that sketch without getting into too much detail. And remember, these initial sketches are like, you're only trying to get a general sense for how you're going to attack this design problem, not necessarily a detailed sense. So I find that super helpful and useful. I wish that I had implemented that when I was in architecture school, because I was always sketching these really big sketches that were really ugly. This is actually much more useful for me to incorporate into my workflow. Another example here. So this is a sketch that's a little more developed. It gives you a sense for scale. I do still sketch a lot on Post-its, and then I also use my iPad a lot now. It's just easier to work digitally sometimes. It gives you a sense for really how small these sketches can be. And this sketch here, I actually could not sit down and just draw this sketch. It actually takes multiple overlays for me to create a sketch that looks like this. When I actually sketch something, it looks more like this, which is really messy. And I tend to overlay it with trace, or if I'm working digitally, I'll overlay it with another layer and then get more refined. So there's the same sketch, a little bit more refined. And then we have another sketch, which is more refined, and another overlay over that sketch. And then lastly, we start to add a little bit of color, and that sketch looks like something that's a bit more, oh, I think someone's not muted and they've, okay, we'll keep going. Anyway, so this sketch, which looks somewhat appropriate to send to a client, takes, for me, many overlays. So I tend to overlay, because when I sit down and sketch something, it looks more like this. So anyways, really small sketching, really quick overlays can help me really flesh out what it is I'm trying to achieve in the design. Third one here is change it up. This one is really important for me when I'm working through a process. And I think it's something that can be important if you're in architecture school as well and working in a design studio. There's often this notion that in order to finish a project, you've got to kind of go in a certain order. And that order might be, first thing I need to do is finish my design. Then I've got to do all my drawings, my floor plans, my sections, my elevations. Then I got to work on my renderings, and then I got to put it all together in a presentation. And I have to do the same thing. These same things I have to do for my presentations. But I find often working that way, you tend to get stuck here. You tend to get stuck at the design part. Maybe you're working on like a Rhino model or a Revit model. You're working it, and then it looks great, but all of a sudden you realize I haven't done my drawings, I haven't done my renderings or presentation. often if you are working just on your design, let's say, you can get stuck and just sit there and think and think and think when there's all this other stuff that's piling up that you have to do. So I tend to think of it more less linear and more sort of cyclical, which is design is actually done by all of these things. So if I'm working in a 3D model, let's say, and I get stuck or don't know what to do next, I'll jump into my drawings, in my sections, in my elevations, in my plans. And I'll see and just kind of know, even just not knowing what you're going to do, knowing like, I've got to set them up. Let me set up my sections, set them all up. And in doing that, you'll actually influence your design. You'll start realizing things about your design that you weren't thinking of, and it'll keep you moving. Similarly with setting up your renderings and setting up your presentations, all of these actually are design. So I tend to, if I find myself stuck in a certain problem while I'm trying to design, not being able to figure it out, I'll jump to a different task, and often that will solve the problem for me. So the important thing is like keep moving, and you're also not thinking in the back of your head, oh man, I've got all this other work to do that I haven't even started yet. Everything's kind of happening at the same time, and it makes for a more cohesive design because you're looking at it from all directions. This is, I don't have any images for this example, but this is probably of all of them, maybe the most important for me, which is just constantly changing up and working back and forth. Changing up tasks, it keeps you moving, and then it makes the design better, in my experience. All right, this last one, be flexible. This is probably, so I worked at a firm before I started out on my own, and I was lead designer there, and I got to work on a lot of larger projects, and we had very good clients, and I found myself kind of, I didn't get as much constructive, or let's say critical feedback as I do now that I'm on my own. Because when you work with an office, you've got the full force of this office and the name and the brand behind you. When you're on your own, you've got you. So I find that clients challenge me a lot more that I'm not on my own than they did when I was in an office. And I've really had to adapt to learn how to be flexible. And I've learned from that in the past 18 months. It's actually been pretty cool experience. So, you know, I used to be like this, and maybe sometimes you're like this when you first design a project. You made the perfect design. Your first design critique, you made this what you thought was an awesome design. You're done, right? What next project, right? I find that actually is not the best architecture, is not created from creating the best design the first time around. There's often factors and things that you haven't considered that need to be incorporated into the design. So I find often that when I'm flexible and open to criticism, it's often better architecture. So when I actually take client feedback, find out what actually they're trying to achieve, the result is even better than what I once thought was the perfect design. And I've got two very specific examples here to go through that I'll show you all that illustrate this. So this is an existing house in Laguna Beach in Southern California. It used to be a ranch style home built in the mid 60s. And then at some point in time in the 70s, somebody turned it into sort of a Spanish revival with the archway in the front door, some cottage style windows, just a lot of kind of crazy stuff. And my client said, let's redo the entryway. Let's just make it better. So I said, awesome. Came up with the design concept here, put together these, what I thought were great diagrams for him. Essentially, the back of the house has a really big hill that looks out over to the Pacific Ocean, which is beautiful in Laguna. It's right up in the Laguna Hills. And from the front of the home, you can't really tell that there's a view out the back. So the idea really was to open up this entryway and give someone entering the home an idea of the view that was beyond. And so I developed this concept of this kind of portal frame, sort of L-shaped form entry. Showed it to my client. I thought it was super cool. He looked at it, he said, this is great, except can you try to do a Craftsman version? And so he had, I guess a ton of his neighbors had just recently done renovations and transformed all their houses into Craftsman. So I begrudgingly said, yeah, sure, I can do a Craftsman version. And I sent him this. This is what his house would look like if it's Craftsman, totally decked out. New entryway, you got the stone plinths all the way through. And he said, this looks great. And he pretty much wanted to do this, but unfortunately for me, being a modernist, this is a real bummer. And it wasn't necessarily creating unique and interesting architecture, which was one of the goals I had for setting out, starting my own practice, was really to try to create unique and interesting architecture and not just copy something that already exists. So I called the client up and I asked him, what do you like about the Craftsman version? What is it that you're really drawn towards? And the answers he gave were actually good answers. First is he wanted to pay homage more to the original ranch style of the home. He liked what the neighbors are doing. Some of them were doing Craftsman. And then he also wanted to do more. He liked that instead of just focusing on the entranceway, we're actually redoing the entire front of the house. So I took that feedback and said, cool, pay homage to the ranch style of the home. That's mid-century modern. We can make this mid-century modern, which ties into me as a modernist. I can do that sort of thing. Like what the neighbors are doing, sure, let's figure out what they're doing. Let's figure out a better way to do it. And then do more. Let's renovate not only the entry, but the entire home. No problem. Let's do that. And so came up with a new concept, which is sort of still, a new iteration on the same concept, which is still this large entryway, which is framed, opened up a lot more minimal, and was able to come up with this rendering here, which shows, again, just sort of a simple steel portal frame, very nice, simple details, similar to what some of his neighbors are doing, but in my opinion, a little bit better, a little bit tighter. And then here's the final elevation showing how we'd redo the entire front of that house. Picking up some of the elements of the neighbors, picking up a little bit of the siding of the entrance, which is a little bit more traditional, but then fielding either side with really cool steel shelf details, a new modern fence along there, and then it's awesome metal and glass garage door through there. And that's where we ended up, and that's what we're actually doing. And I narrowly avoided having to design and document a Craftsman home. Thank goodness, because I don't know if I could even do that. This next project, another great example of being flexible. This is the backyard of a home down in San Diego. And the clients want to add a second story addition over it, basically over the garage. And this is the back of the garage right here, and we'd be going up over the garage. There'd be a staircase leading up to this addition. And this client's great. He's a developer and he actually really loves modern architecture, super great client. So I said, awesome, this is my chance. I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna create this super crazy, cool, sleek, modern form. And showed him this and said, look what we can do. We can open up the back. We can create that second story, make it really, really clean, pick up the same materials as the rest of the home in a more streamlined way, add some stairs going up to a landing, and then beneath them, we'll tuck in this outdoor shower that he said he wanted. And so this is what it would look like from an angle. You see that outdoor shower tucked in there. I was super excited to go into the client's house, presented this to him very excitedly, and he said, I don't like it. So again, had to go back and say, okay, well, what is it that you don't like about this? And he came back with, I want it to be more open. I want my backyard to be a space that I can hang out in, and I want the house to not turn its back on the backyard. It should be open. It should feel like an indoor-outdoor connection with the backyard, so that I'm back there, I feel like I can see in the house. When I'm in the house, I can see out there. And then lastly, I like the existing roof line. I want you to rethink it in a more clean way. So taking this feedback, could have turned away the project at that point and said, no, this is the way to go. Absolutely. This is going to win me so many awards. Let's do this. And said, okay, let's actually take that feedback and think about what we can actually do with this feedback. And eventually ended up here, which is actually a lot more robust than the original architecture. It's a lot more open. We've got this cool form on the top here that actually cantilevers along all sides. So it feels as if this thing is sort of floating over the rest of the home. We've still got our outdoor shower, but this gave us an opportunity to hone it with some board form concrete. And then we open the entire bottom layer up. We've got an opening sliding panel door here, as well as this cool custom screen element, which will allow ivy to grow up and feel like your indoor-outdoor space is really, that line is really being blurred there. Here, another shot of that, just showing kind of the difference and what that will look like. And I'm actually really excited about this, and I never would have gotten there if I had stuck to my guns and said, no, client, we gotta do the original version I did. But it took that back and forth, and it took that flexibility to get there. So here's the front of the home, just to give you a sense for what the front's gonna look like as well. So again, just to recap, the 4 things that I've really learned over the past 18 months: stick with a concept, sketch really small, change up the tasks that you're working on to keep moving, and then lastly, be really flexible when you're working with clients, and take their feedback and really take it to heart and listen to what they're actually trying to achieve, and it will actually create better architecture in the end. So that's it. That's me. Feel free to follow me on Instagram for Stereo, and I'm happy to take questions now. I think that was actually pretty quick. We're at 12:30, so happy to field any questions anyone has. No questions. All right.
You're not getting out of here that easy.
Yeah.
I, I'm curious. You know, there are, you know, in your marketplace where you are right now.
Yep.
Um, you know, can you afford to say, you know, this is just the style of home that I do, and if you want to work with me and engage my services, you're going to get a modern take on whatever it is you're looking for, or
Yeah.
yeah, you know what I'm getting after. Like, are you cutting yourself off from, you know, revenue
Yeah.
stream by saying, yeah, you know, sorry, I don't do prairie style.
Yeah. That's a great question. Is it Ezra? Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great question, Ezra. So the answer to that question is yes, I am. You know, I could certainly document houses that I wasn't really that interested in doing and make money doing that, but I don't want to do that. So if there are, you know, I set out to start on my own because I wanted to create interesting architecture. So if there are times like right now, certainly work is quieted down tremendously. I'm supposed to have 2 projects under construction right now, and both of them are halted, you know, indefinitely. We don't really know when they're going to pick up. Hopefully later this year, we're not sure. And so I do other things. I'll do contract work for firms if I need to. I'll also do, you know, I teach. But my goal is to try to create unique and interesting architecture because that's what I enjoy doing. And if I, you know, worst case scenario, let's say that meant that all of a sudden the work dries up, I would just get another job working for someone else who does that kind of architecture, I suppose. So my end goal is to do the kind of work I want to do. And the end goal isn't necessarily just to have a business for the sake of having a business, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Good
And
for
so
you.
far I've been lucky. I've been really lucky. My clients have actually been pretty good. The closest I got to doing something that I wasn't extremely excited about was when we had that Craftsman House conversation with the client. We almost, I mean, he was like dead set, we're going to do that. And I basically had to say, you know, I think we can do better. And I think where we ended up is actually going to be better in the end. And that's what I tried to kind of convey to him. And eventually he agreed.
Yeah, I like how that project turned out, and I think the one of the more interesting things that you said was the sort of the cycle of referencing your design back to your original intention. So from plan to section to elevation,
Yeah.
that not stopping that discovery process and not letting those new discoveries reflect back into your to previous iterations to grow the things. That was
Yeah.
that's a great point. It feels like you don't really have a lot of time to get there when you're in school,
Right. Right.
but when you're
Yeah.
actually practicing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of you've got, you know, you have to make these deadlines, right? Like your livelihood lives on it. And so I actually almost consider it cheating to pick a concept and stick with it because it forces me to be focused and my mind doesn't wander so much, you know, and it's, at first I kind of thought, well, maybe I'm not exploring enough. But now I realize if I really focus in hard on what I'm doing, I get deeper into the design rather than exploring many different possibilities at a much higher level and less detailed level. I have another question here. Looks like we have Braden says, Yuna is asking whether your sketches are shared with clients. Not always. Sometimes I do. So when I presented this to a client, what was this one here? And I basically flew down to San Diego and left the meeting with, I don't like it. I sort of freaked out. And so that's when on the airplane, I actually, I said, well, I like this client. I want to make him really happy. And I want to do something that makes this into a killer project. And so actually on the airplane, I'm gonna go back here, ended up with that final sketch I showed you. Where is it? Let's go back. This sketch here. So I left that meeting with a rendering he didn't like, and on the airplane back, I did these iterations, the overlays, and then emailed this to him as soon as I got off the airplane because I wanted him to know that I was hearing his feedback. And we still moved on, you know, from this. These approaches are helpful to students. My 11-year-old wants to ask, are their opinions of the architect and the client equal? Does one have more leverage? That's a great question. Wow. So you think of it, you're not just, there's this misconception, I think, that architects are just designers, right? And it's all subjective. Well, architects are designers, and there's certainly a subjective component to our work, but we're also experts. right? We're also experts. We know how to organize space. We know how a space is going to feel, right? And we know how a certain aesthetic is going to be in line with the client's goals. So I think the important question is, does the client understand the architect's goals? And does the architect, do the architect and client have the shared vision, right? And you don't want to be in this scenario where you're fighting with the client. That's not a good scenario to be in. So I try to always show potential clients the kind of work that I do and the kind of solutions I come up with, so we're on the same page. Because if you have a client who wants something totally different than the kind of work you do, it's sort of a non-starter. So they should find another architect who specializes in that. I specialize in sort of more modern architecture. Other architects specialize in more traditional architecture, and clients should gravitate towards the right architect. And I do that purposely because I feel that specializing in specific types of style, specific types of a style, makes you better and better. Thank you, Zach. You've reconfirmed many ideas we talked about studying class. These are not just academic practice, making deadlines. Yes, this is another important concept for survival. Absolutely. Oh, that's Jennifer. Yeah. No, deadlines. I mean, I'm working through weekends a lot. I'm knocking stuff out, and it's not all pretty pictures. I could also do a whole sketch on all the construction documents you have to do for this stuff. And that is the stuff that keeps you awake at night, because you're even like that vertical screen that's got the ivy growing up on it. That's kind of in the sketch here. The details for that, I had to call probably 5 different manufacturers, find the right tensile wire diameter to use, find something that's not going to rust. That's a half a day of research just for that one detail, and then you've got to draw it. I don't see, am I missing any other questions that are on here? Articulation of process. What CAD software do you use in your renderings? So I use Revit 100%. I teach the Revit class here at the Academy of Art, ARH 399. I learned Revit about 15 years ago, and I actually taught it professionally for a number of years at architecture firms, and I just loved it because I was really quick with it. So I use all Revit, and then I use Inkscape, which is a really good tool for rendering. So that's my workflow currently. I only use AutoCAD if I have like an import from a consultant. I'll import it in, but I never draw in AutoCAD anymore. I did when I first started. And for what it's worth, I actually failed Revit when I took it in school. So there you go. So sometimes something that seems daunting at first can actually be turned into something positive. Does teaching architecture help you in your process? Yeah, that's a great question, Juke. Yeah, because even like doing this lecture here and having to formulate my thoughts, like I didn't realize, like I knew I was doing things, but I didn't realize like what I was doing. And so actually having to formulate it and write it down and tell it to someone else makes you kind of think, wow, this is what I'm actually doing. And it kind of helps kind of formulate your process a little more. Plus I like it. Plus I like getting out of the house once a week. Though now I'm not getting out of the house, but at least I'm doing something different once a week. Let's see, did I miss any? Studio and classes, deadlines. Yep. When do you transition from sketching to digital modeling? Oh, that's an awesome question. Juan asked that. I start by sketching. So first thing I'll do is I'll make a model of the existing space. Like most of my projects are renovation projects, so there's an existing house. So I'll get into it and I'll make a Revit model of it. So I'll be digitally, and then so it gets my head really into it, and then I'll sketch, and force myself to only sketch for a while and not even, I won't even touch it for like the first week. I'll just sketch. But I never just present a client with sketches. I like to always present them some sort of digital rendering or model or drawing, because I find that it just feels more, I don't know, feels more robust, I guess. Feels like you've done more work. But I will often sketch, and sometimes my sketches will like they'll often just look like this here, and that's enough for me to get the idea across to myself. Is there one more question here? Really appreciate the sketch as part of your iterative process. You share this. Okay, I think I answered that one. Aside from experience, are there exercises or questions you ask yourself to help determine if design is bad or not? Yeah, Ernesto, that's a really good question. I think, like I showed that example of the interior design product where I listed out what we were trying to do. Even with I might make a list as I'm sketching that's like verbal, like here's what I'm trying to achieve. And I might often go back to that. And even in a more abstract sense, think about geometry. What's this geometry trying to do? And then write down what I think the geometry is trying to do. And then as I iterate, try to always go back to that. And I don't know necessarily, I think if you're achieving the client's goals and you're creating something unique and interesting that's actually buildable, to me, that means that the design is heading in a good direction and not bad. I think I would feel like a design was bad if I hadn't challenged myself enough. I think I would consider it bad at that point. What are some do and don'ts when working with Revit? Let's see, do and don'ts when working with Revit. I would say push Revit around. Don't let Revit push you around. I think a lot of people get intimidated by it. I used to, when I would teach it at architecture firms, I'd take someone's mouse and keyboard and I'd spin around the model. I'd delete everything and then I'd Control Z and undelete it. It's like, see, you can't break it. It's just a model. And I think like not being intimidated by the software is a big thing. Like you own the software. It's a tool. It's a hammer for you to hammer out that design. It doesn't own you. In terms of like more specifics, I have a Revit workshop every Wednesday from 1 to 3. Karen, you should join it and we can talk about more specific details. Any questions, Josh? Have to go. Thank you, Ezra. I think I answered all the, if anyone asked a question, I missed it, feel free to copy and paste it back in. Otherwise, I think
I'll just say as well, Zach, I'll say that I've been recording the meeting so we can make that available as well later for students.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And maybe one last thing that I would ask is, I think your talk has been a very relevant one, because for someone who works, doing a sole design practice like yours, especially in a time that we're in now where everybody's working on their own in their homes in isolation, right?
Right.
And so all of our students are used to being in the studio culture as we know it and bouncing ideas off of other students and other people. Yep. Is there any advice you can give in terms of, not having that person next to you to bounce an idea off of? What do you do instead?
Yeah, so I briefly kind of talked about changing tasks. Sometimes I call it like wear a different hat. I literally I'll come in one morning and be like, okay, I'm the production guy in the office who just does drawings, and I'm going to work as if that's the person I am this morning. And I'm going to take this fluffy rendering the lead designer did last night, turning it into some really awesome drawings, and see practically what I think's not working about this design. And I'll sometimes I'll be intentional about that headspace, about kind of saying, okay, this rendering has to be done tonight because tomorrow morning, construction document Zach is coming in. He's gonna look at this from a technical standpoint. That's kind of a silly answer, but it's true. And the other thing is too, like, you can't always design in isolation. I'll text things to other architect friends of mine, people I used to work with. I'll get on Slack. I actually have a friend of mine. He's a sole proprietor too, and we'll often call each other. Sometimes with design, but mostly it's like, I can't figure this detail out. I can't get this fire rating to work. What would you do? Walk me, tell me I'm not crazy, stuff like that. And that can become really useful. And I've also, something that's been extremely important is I've reached out to mentors, people who are practicing on their own, who are like 10 years older than me. So often I'll print out like a construction set. I have a guy that I go to in Santa Rosa. He's great. He's a great architect. And I go and show him all my waterproofing details. And I say, hey, what am I not thinking of? What's not working here? What could I do better? So just reaching out to people who know more than you do has been helpful too.
Zachary, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I used to use it's like Revit.
Yeah.
So I started from interior design and in architecture, but kind of sometimes confused why architect, like especially in the architectural department, they do not sometimes allowed to use Revit and like against Revit. So they push in more use like CAD and Rhino, but I know it's like in real life actually, like, it's preferable like no Revit.
Well, I think Revit, Revit is very specific. The difference between Revit and Rhino is that Revit knows you're drawing a building, right? Whereas Rhino just is 3-dimensional vector drawing. It's like, right? And I think that it is important to get to know yourself as a designer using a tool that doesn't have any preconceptions. So I used Form Z when I was in school, which is like archaic now. We didn't really use Rhino at that point. And it was really helpful because I can just build whatever I want. So I think a lot, when you're in architecture school, we want to expose you to those tools so that you're not just drawing out of the box stuff. Now, I think that there's a certain point where you get sort of your first couple years down and you've kind of got a sense for where you are as a designer, where you can start incorporating Revit because it really helps. produce drawings and things at a much quicker pace.
Yes,
So
sure.
I think there's a balance. Yeah, I think there's a balance. If I'm being totally honest, sometimes I think, man, I should buy Rhino too, and just always have a separate software to explore things in. But I can't afford to buy both Revit and Rhino. So, I also think though that a lot of folks have not spent enough time with Revit to really kind of push it around and get it to do what you want. And it is a little slow at first. So I see why that conception's there. I challenge my students in ARH 399 to create interesting forms and things utilizing Revit. And we try to push the boundaries of what can be done in that class.
But Revit is like, there kind of, you can actually, it could be flexible too, right? So
yeah, I can. Yeah, it's
very
certainly
create actual forms too, like, 3D dimensional.
You can, absolutely. There's conceptual masking tools that you can use to create those things. There's definitely a lot of tools to do that. Yeah, for sure. But I think it's important to expose yourself to as many softwares as possible while you're in school, because you never know what office you're going to work at. Like, imagine you found this awesome architecture firm, but they only use Rhino and you never used it in school. You'd be like, well, I can't get a job there because I don't know the tools. So exposing yourself to as many tools as possible is important. I failed Revit in school, and I came out using AutoCAD and got a job using AutoCAD. Then I worked at a firm where there was a guy there who was really good at Revit, and I really liked him. We became friends, and I learned Revit from him and got really good at it. Then I started teaching it. So you never know kind of where these things are going to take you in the beginning.
I learned 3D Max, and then it's like I'm not using it at all because it's like it's time consuming, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's like in real life, again, it's like, especially like big offices, when we had a field trip to Gensler.
Right, sure.
Yeah, Gensler. And then it's like they were talking about like, the way they work. So they actually overseas their like rendering work to, like, they probably, I don't know, Hong Kong or Poland.
Yeah.
So their team sitting actually and quick doing like specifically working in 3D Max. So for them, actually it's more effective, it's like effective and cheaper probably.
Right. Right.
Overseas, so they don't care, like, if 3D Max, but they care if you know Revit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Revit certainly, in terms of just getting a job, is certainly a very marketable tool to use. So, which it's my fallback plan. If tomorrow Prestereo can't exist anymore, I just go consult at firms with Revit, and I can survive on that. And then
like you said,
try again.
Actually, like all software programs, but it's kind of like.
Yeah, but it is, but like I said, there's plenty of time also to pick that up when you're out of school. The important thing is when you're in school is to learn how you are as a designer and explore, I mean, but I consider myself like maybe a 10th of the way in terms of as being a designer and doing the kind of work I do. Maybe I was like 10% there when I finished school. There was still so much. I learned definitely learned more when I left school than during school. It was sort of like my initial exposure and just trying out different things. And then eventually you kind of figure out what works and you improve and you improve when you get out. Cool. Well, thanks everyone so much. This was really fun. And thanks to you, Braden, for setting this up. I'll hand it back to you.
That's great. Thanks, Zach. Thanks everybody for attending and the great questions as well. I think there's so much useful information that Zach was able to show us there. Again, I've recorded this talk, so once I get that downloaded, we can make it available so people can go back and access some of this again. So thanks, and reminder that next week, same day, same time, will be the next talk. And that is it. I will end the recording now. And I think my students from my History 1 class are probably in the meeting right now, so you all stay while everybody else leaves. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.